Hello, and welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Be sure to catch this podcast anywhere you get your usual podcast and find us at the ScholarAI YouTube channel. Hey, guys, everybody, how's everybody doing today? Lakshay, Shashi, where's this podcast find you?
Still in Portland. We're having a lovely set of winter storms that are in a trough for now, and they're supposed to resume later this week. But yeah, otherwise just enjoying the snow. I live right next to a forest. So I spent some time with some buddies just like walking through it. A lot of the trees and branches collapsed and the trail had completely disappeared. And we definitely got a lot further into it than we thought we were. So we spent a good portion of the sunset and time after finding our way back through a dark, snowy forest last night. But yeah.
Literally lost in the woods.
The darkness aspect has kind of been exacerbated because you've been telling us about some power outages that you all have been having. So,
Yeah, as of, I guess it was mostly Saturday. I have this habit of like my phone and my like laptop battery are pretty good. So I won't like charge them like overnight because I don't want the battery to deprecate because they overcharge. So if I have like 50% battery, I'll just like leave them wherever, like no big deal. At 2 or so p.m., the entire like Portland metro area started having these like big, like massive outages. Like obviously like from trees falling on power line, just big snow, like even like signal like from LTE and 5G was crappier just because of like all the obviously stuff in the atmosphere. And we were enjoying a lot of darkness given that like Portland these days it gets dark at like 4 p.m. And so I was just walking around with like lantern light trying to figure out what to do because my laptop was at like 5% battery as of like 3 p.m. with nothing to charge it with. So I had a very productive day watching Better Call Saul with the 2% battery that my phone managed to keep holding on to into the depths of the night.
Yeah, that's brutal. That's brutal. But the power's back now. Everything's all good. So people are kind of waking up to it. Shashi, where you at? You in Houston?
In Houston, yeah, we're going to get 20-degree evenings for the next few days here. All the plants are going to die, and which we're accustomed to, either from the floods or from the freezes. So at this point, we've all been battle hardened sufficiently from weather events. But it's going to get cold. School districts are probably going to close. 20 degrees is anything in the 20s is pretty anomalous for where we are in Texas. So anyway, kids are going to be home and driving parents crazy for the next couple of days in all likelihood.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. I'm in Durham, which of all of the potentials is relatively mundane. It's been pretty steady. Like we had a low 50s yesterday. It was pretty nice. Today we're high in the mid 40s. I think we are going to get a little bit of precipitation, and we've had some rain, but nothing really to speak of. So I am watching just because of the NFL playoffs going on. Like some of my family lives in Kansas City, and they had a historically cold game there over the weekend. And then obviously, as of recording of this in about an hour, the Steelers are going to kick off in Buffalo, New York, and they're kind of, I think over the weekend they received something on the order of like 2 feet worth of snow, 18 to 22 inches, I've heard. So, anyway, going to be interesting. And I think that, we're going to see some, interesting weather as it moves across the U.S. I'm pivoting slightly from weather, but then something is somewhat related. We've seen some kind of dramatic weather this year. In addition to the weather, we've also seen kind of war in various parts of the world. So I'm wondering, Shashi, if you will, just tee us up. You kind of sent a message to us today just saying that so far this year has kind of been almost characterized by these anomalies, whether it be weather or war. And so just, if you will, just kind of take us through your thought process there, what you think the kind of ramifications of those might be and otherwise.
We've had a couple of quiet weather years. We had Harvey was a major disaster a couple of years ago, but then we had a couple of quiet years in weather, and I think it's easy for us to have short-term memory in terms of weather disasters and what they represent. So far, the story of 2024 has been weather and war, extreme weather events, and obviously the ongoing wars that are happening in Ukraine, Russia, and in Gaza as well, Gaza, Palestine. So, and not to mention the conflicts that are escalating with the Houthis and and on-sea battle that's emerging, and the potential for more conflict with Iran should escalation take place. So far, 2024 has been primarily characterized in my mind by war and weather, which are both kind of deviations from what most people probably expected even a couple of weeks ago.
I think it's interesting, and then speculating as to like what the fallout might be with regards to our business or other businesses. Do you see that as overall antagonistic to what would otherwise be deflationary in some cases, or do you think it's going to influence that in maybe unforeseen ways? Do you want to speculate at all as to what you think might be the fallout of those things?
Supply chains is the starting point of that kind of thought process for me is supply chain and the disruption to supply chain. We've over the last 20, 30 years, we've developed a global system of production that relies on things getting shipped around the world and work being distributed globally. And with these kinds of events, you have, for example, servers being taken down in parts of the world. You have shipping containers being taken down in parts of the world. And so it's really going to test resiliency of our supply chains and our ability to deliver goods and services on a globally integrated way, but with parts of that map going on and offline, whether that's for weather events or war. So I think that will certainly be a test. And of course, there's the energy conversation. Energy and oil and Middle Eastern wars are deeply entwined. So energy can always be a spike should there be an escalation in conflict.
I think as we've seen more interconnection of the world, especially as we've seen offshore goods manufacturing with respect to kind of, being U.S. centric for a moment here, it does feel like anytime there is somewhat of a global conflict, the Russian-Ukraine war being the slightly longer example of the ones we've mentioned today, there have been disruptions. I also reflecting on the complete disruption that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. It feels like a lot of these supply chains have insulated themselves slightly. So I am curious to see what the fallout of that might be. I'm saying, whereas it felt like a lot of the bottlenecks were at least identified during COVID-19 and people were making strides to maybe build in redundancies or to be able to weather some sort of storm, either real or metaphorical. So I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely not a geopoliticist and I don't kind of pretend to be, but it is always fascinating to see what the ramifications of things like this are, especially with respect to like getting over hard goods. There's an entire discussion to be had around like the world's central reliance on semiconductors being produced in, 1, 2, or 3 spots and those kind of things. So it's a fascinating discussion, in any event. But kind of leaving that for a moment, we've been in a little bit of upheaval ourselves internally at ScholarAI over the last week or so, just given the recent announcements that were the OpenAI GPT store. So, Akshay, if you will, you want to just take us through the narrative that's been kind of your last week and the firefighting that you've been doing?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing. So OpenAI does this thing where like, obviously they have all these like internal plans and like all sorts of projects. They work on so many things, right? And we knew the GPT store was coming, but the level of notification we got is it's happening sometime next week. Be warned. And so we've been cooking up like, okay, let's make a web app. Like we're going to make sure like everything's successful for everyone. Like let's make sure we can get this launched out. And a week basically like aligned with the time we're ready to launch and like put it out into the world. GPT store also happens. I think the nice thing is that like in this like kind of API driven product that we have, like it's not necessarily, I don't think it's like necessarily like a split effort. Like obviously like any work we do on the GPT ends up helping the web app, which is excellent. But it was just like a big like get up and go moment very, very suddenly. Cause it was just like kind of like, I just really wish they'd give us like a month's notice, man. Like it's something better than a week, dude. Like there's like so much like that goes into like thinking about like the position we were in to the position we want to be in. And like, for example, like the plugin, a lot of people just don't know that GPT exists yet. A lot of people don't know the GPT store is a thing. A lot of people still use the plugin, but obviously the GPT is kind of the future. How do people pull people over there? How do we pull people to the web app and provide value in that thing? It's just like it very quickly became a little bit of a potpourri, like mentally, of just like, there's 7 things to figure out here. What's the first one I should pick? And even that ends up being like mentally confusing because there's so many different priorities to juggle.
Yeah, that's great. And then you said that your kind of belief, just pulling on one of those threads, is that the plugin is not necessarily becoming obsolete, but you actually see greater functionality being added to the GPT and even the larger GPT ecosystem inside of ScholarAI. Do you want to take us through some of the things that you either know or that you're kind of hypothesizing will happen in that space?
Like GPTs generally, or with us?
I think both. So my intuition from kind of the tea leaves that I've been able to read, not being hands on in developing these products, but is that OpenAI is either de-emphasizing or altogether sunsetting the plugin ecosystem, meaning that kind of all of these third-party apps, quote unquote, that have been built inside of the ChatGPT ecosystem are migrating or transitioning over to GPTs. And so just kind of like along that similar line of thinking, I guess number one, gut check that hypothesis. Do you also believe that? And then number two, if so, do you think the ramifications for both us and other people?
Yeah. I mean, like, to me, like, plugins are legacy. Like, I just call them legacy. If a customer asks me like, hey, I saw this new GPT thing came out, I'm a plugin user, what should I do? I just straight up say, plugin sunset, like, go to the GPT. Like, that's the place where like everything new, all the new features, everything is going to be. With the GPT store, the OpenAI team, at least the section of it that's behind the GPT store, did like an AMA on Discord last week. And in it, like, I think that the biggest thing to like discern is that like a lot of the complaints about like the plugin like marketplace is the term that they use for, is just like, hey, if you weren't one of like the first 10 or 12 plugins, like it's very, very hard for anyone to get discovered, to like be found. But a lot of what you'd expect out of like a standard app store is coming, right? Like customer reviews are coming. There's all sorts of ideas about like, hey, like let me remix someone's GPT. How can I give access and like let people create their own off of the thing I made? And so I think like if you are an OpenAI developer, like obviously like there's web applications you can make built on AI APIs and whatever, but if you're trying to invest in like being on a new platform, the OpenAI GPT store is like the one to be, right? Like that's just like, there's no developer focused GPT store that seems to have the level of investment that this one does, you know, especially with like, we'll see how there's always this thing called like the cold start problem, where like when there's a new platform, a new store, like getting noticed or like starting from nothing is very, very hard. I think obviously like as tech goes forward, there's a lot of companies playing in generative AI. There's a lot of companies that are like trying to start something new, even like solo devs. I'm interested to see what they end up figuring out for like the featured or explore page. Cause there's simply just so much, and creating a GPT is so easy. Like it's very easy to create fluff and like occupy space in the store. Which I think is going to be like a pretty prominent problem, but if you create something quality, it's a place to put it.
Yeah. It feels to me like OpenAI took a lot of the lessons learned during the initial launch of the plugins and tried to roll that forward as innovations in the GPT store. That sits in a little bit of juxtaposition, though, to the ease at which they've made making a GPT and the kind of narrative that GPTs are a kind of a layman tool such that people can go and build their own without code. So I'm not really making any sweeping statements with respect to those two thoughts, other than just to say that in some ways they seem contradictory, and it's going to be interesting to watch play out how OpenAI tries to balance those two things, or if they balance those two things. And like you said, how that kind of lends itself to discoverability of the GPTs. Does it kind of become this all or nothing in which, you know, some GPTs receive all the attention, whereas others haven't? And we've kind of seen as such, right? I mean, we kind of appeared on the trending pages as soon as the GPT store had come out, and we've seen some of our traffic migrate over there. But like you're saying, people are still hanging around. A large fraction of users are still using the plugin. We've got new things like the Copilot coming out that are gonna be available to people outside of the ChatGPT ecosystem as well. So I don't know, a lot of things happening, a lot of really exciting times. Josh, you want to reflect on kind of the last day with respect to the GPT store, but then how it translates to ScholarAI or beyond?
The question in my mind is how developer friendly is the OpenAI platform, and how well are they supporting professional endeavors via their infrastructure? And I think there's room to get better there. What does a professional development team with financial investment want? It wants a monetizing model. It wants IP protection. So you put your brand on something. There's some verification process. We saw that many others were trying to spoof our brand and offer the quote unquote ScholarAI GPT that weren't our team, and OpenAI didn't really have a process in place to filter those out. It seems like a system that is built for more of a hobbyist or a non-professional application, meaning an individual person who wants to create a tool for themselves. It doesn't really seem at this stage geared to professional development teams trying to create economic value and investing serious time and money into their application. It appears the vision, I'm interested in hearing how you react to this. The vision seems to be that they are transitioning, they want to transition from kind of the app style world that we've lived in to an API style world where the GPTs can span across and plug into lots of different API sets to get the right functions, execute the right work, ask the right questions, seek out the right information sets. And in that world, I'm curious as to how those API creators make enough financial return that it's worth offering their API to that kind of framework.
I think lacing that idea with one of the ideas that Lecce propositioned, which was the idea of remixing, right? What exactly that remixing means? Does it mean that you get access to the API, the underlying, code that runs it? I don't exactly know. I think it's an interesting thought. Yeah. In many ways, I'm not sure. Lecce, you got specific thoughts to that?
Yeah, I think when I think about the idea of moving from an app world to an API world, something that I kind of always think about is that APIs have always been developer oriented. It's not, if you're non-technical, there's no reason you should be looking at API documentation, right? And in the idea of kind of remixing, it makes a little bit of sense where okay, we move closer and closer to a no code system where you don't need to be someone who knows JavaScript or Python to be able to make a system do what you want it to do, right? You just trust the LLM to put together the pieces. It takes care of you the rest of the way. I think the GPTs, I think as just a sole unit make a lot of sense of just hey, yeah, it makes sense. We've gotten requests before that hey, this research lab wants to make the prompting very specific to this field. They don't have to do it over and over. Give them an API, let them carry on that way, right? But I think when you go just a little bit beyond that, and you kind of think about what does it mean for an app first world versus an API first world? How important is a UI? How important is the experience that you're really giving? Are there actual cases where not having a tailored UI or a tailored UX can actually serve value, right? And you, again, with the idealized sci-fi, you just talk to a personal assistant, get stuff done for you, right? But in the more expectable future, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of professions where that's necessarily true, right? Where you can simply operate on text in, text out. The way people are using ChatGPT these days is you text in, text out, and you copy the text over to something else, or you iterate on it over and over until you can then copy the text to something else, or it writes into a document that you then send to people or whatever. So it just seems I think in an API first world, I see a growing possibility that APIs become something that are no code friendly. As to how that manifests beyond just, okay, I made a custom GPT that helps me with prompting a little bit, I'm not exactly sure. There's just again, it's hard for me to think of professional applications where you can assert, I don't need a UI for this.
Are there companies out there that make the majority of their revenue via API? And if so, what do those kinds of use cases look like?
I mean, I think when I think of API first businesses, Stripe is the biggest one that comes to mind, where their development pattern or the product they built was very much focused on being an API product first, right? And obviously, like when you use Stripe, like the physical value you're getting is like the space that someone can enter in their credit card, subscribe, manage their subscription, etc. And on the back end, they're providing you all the APIs you need to do literally anything relating to financial systems for your business, right? And so there are businesses that like sell APIs. Like, I mean, like, of course, we're in like academic spaces, so a lot of those tend to be free and like for like good intent. But there's businesses that like will, of course, like you can pay in to get access to their data. There's like like cloud-based ones where like you want storage, like AWS, you could in a way think of as an API business, right? It's all just like, what's the level of functionality that you want and how's it being provided to you? In the case of an API, like that covers a lot of cases for someone like AWS or someone like Stripe. But when we're getting into like consumer applications, what does an API first world look like and how does monetizing that look like is very much an unknown.
In some ways, the dashboard that typically accompanies these APIs become the UI, UX, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe the ease of integration with a large language model or some sort of agent that you're running. And I can envision a world in which if the world that we did kind of that you are all speaking about, this API first world does come to fruition where I am a user, I have maybe several agents working in concert, and I simply want to plug one or many of them into these APIs, right? I want these various services. I want these various data sets. I want controlled access to them. I want to know what's coming in, or what's going in and what's coming out of these systems. I do think that, in some ways, if you're right and that API becomes, relatively speaking, accessible via no-code solutions, then that UX UI, that dashboard is going to be kind of a new battleground, right? Who can deliver these insights in the most digestible way, will probably have some sort of significant advantage. So,
yeah, because I think also like, okay, sorry, with the like background that we have, obviously like we're running a business. A lot of us are technical. Like the stuff that we care about relating to our APIs is like graphs, metrics, like how stuff being used. Like we want data on everything and anything, right? And there also comes to the level of privacy where like, okay, let's assume that we have this API first world and there's this one sole platform that's responsible for like presenting everything I need to know. What is that platform allowed to see? Are all of a sudden like, does everyone just assume that their data is going to be exposed to whoever the platform holder is? Can everything like that be visualized? How do you protect data from a development team and from a third party team when all of a sudden there's so many people at play?
It seems like there's room for a platform to be more attuned and friendly to professional development teams trying to invest material resources and generate a financial return. OpenAI hasn't yet filled that void, and it seems like there is room, whether Llama or Mistral or something else comes along and offers that economic alignment and upside for investment. Feels like there's room. I totally agree with you, Lakshay, about the point of the cold start, and like nobody else really has the critical mass at this point to do it but OpenAI, but they also aren't fully leveraging that to meet the need of the professional development team.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean to say, Shashi, beyond the API they offer for like GPT-4 in the enterprise version as an example? You mean going beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, and creating a very clear path to generating a financial return for a business trying to invest in on top of OpenAI and their architecture. They haven't yet defined and developed that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the announcement of revenue share is supposed to happen sometime Q1, but like in general, my sense is that's going to be like peanuts mostly. Like I can't imagine it's anything like super significant. And the cold start problem is just going to be exacerbated. Like, how do you disrupt like people who've been there like us from the beginning? How do you like move? Even if you make like some killer application, how do you get found when every single day there's like 100,000 GPTs getting made by people just like wanting to make something mildly custom, right?
Yeah, it feels unlike the analogy that's always drawn in my head is the App Store for obvious reasons, right? They've kind of created this platform, but this one feels distinctly different and for almost exactly the reasons that you just alluded to, and that there's a proliferation of GPTs that simply was impossible for apps because of the barrier to entry, so to speak, for making an app or making a GPT. By reducing that barrier to entry, in some ways, OpenAI has created a general service that more people can use, but in other ways has made it a more difficult signal and noise problem. I mean, there's going to be a lot of GPTs, a lot of kind of quote unquote junk GPTs, and very few as a relative fraction that are creating real value. So it's interesting. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I mean, I'm glad we have a front row seat, but
I wonder whether, like, obviously with all the discussion of agents and like OpenAI being like an agent first like business, or like very focused on the future of agents, I wonder whether like they internally see all this stuff and like think about like, what does a agent version of an app store reviewer look like? Like, I wonder if there's a possibility of this, that like the thing that's approving and letting your GPT exist and choosing to promote it is not a person or like a team. It's just like, oh wow, like this new GPT dropped. I assessed its value. Here is what it does. Pops it into the featured page because of all like the 7,000 it saw today, it seems the statistically most likely to be somewhat quality.
Yes, the Andre Karpathy bot said, "This is the one. Let's promote it."
A new metagame arose. No more SEO. Now it's just convincing the GPT auto reader that you're good.
Did you see the Rabbit device, the little the device that got announced at CES?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of that UI design?
I'm a big fan. I mean, I think like anyone in the tech space who like saw this announcement, saw the teenage engineering was behind it. It's just like they just like design stuff in like a really cool way. So if nothing else, I just like appreciate its aesthetic. Like it felt very like 90s, like Game Boy inspired, but just like modern in some way too. The constant debate that's like at least emerged on Twitter is just like, could this be an app? Like, why do you need this to be like a persistently online thing? I think I really like the device. I think it's cool. And I think the reason a lot of these are being born right now, these like hardware first, like AI products, is just because the iPhone and Android phones just have so many like guardrails on like how much you're allowed to use like their sensors, how much you're allowed to use their cameras, which thus creates like this potential space that like, okay, we make a new set of hardware that doesn't have all these restrictions on how you use their sensors. They're like permanently online. That's part of their value cell. Anyone who buys in is aware of that permission. I think it's cool. I mean, I for one, like I love this stuff. And I think the idea and the possibilities of it are really, really cool. I just don't know what the regulation and such is going to emerge to be like, and how, if Apple responds, what does that look like, given that they've branded themselves on being like very privacy and data protection first? Because it feels like a lot of these things could get blown out of the water if Apple just chooses that they're going to drop that for a little bit.
My thought is actually almost exactly what you finished with there, and that in the very short term, it feels to me like there is room to innovate for AI first hardware. On the back of that, though, it feels like a lot of these large companies, Apple being probably the predominant one, will simply take those learnings and adopt the next version of the iPhone for that exact use case. And, you know, being thinking about this from the consumer perspective, if I can achieve 80% of the functionality of that standalone device with my iPhone, that's probably going to be enough for me, to be determined. But it feels to me like it would be a fairly high barrier to entry to put another device in my pocket or on my person. But speaking of, Josh, I'd love to hear your reaction to that, because I think you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've pre-ordered the Human AI pen, right? So you're at least going to go down the experiment of, you know, this other device being on your person, or at least somewhere, you know, around.
The Rabbit approach is APIs rather than apps natively, which is a really interesting kind of direction. I love the experimentation. I'm not convinced the business will work, but the approach I really like. And the $200 price point, I think, it makes it super attractive for just trying it out. So the threshold for trial is so low with the price point, whereas the Humane Pen is $700 or $800, something like that. So higher threshold for trial. I find the Apple story in both where we began this conversation and this Rabbit really interesting. The Apple App Store is geared toward commercial development teams. It's geared toward revenue production. It's got the IP protection. It's got all the things the OpenAI App Store doesn't have. Apple's got. Apple has not yet gotten into the LLM kind of framework infrastructure game. But if you could imagine, if you could create a version where Apple had a great LLM framework for developers, entirely geared toward developers, they took advantage of what they already did well with their App Store. Maybe instead of a 30% rake, they took it down to 10% and just tried to absorb, like the developer community who wants to build professional apps and wants to have some brand protection. And they could go there and clearly kind of participate. And if that interaction, Apple's got this interesting position where they can easily kind of connect that to the end consumer via the iPhone and feel like, it's protected both ways. Like the businesses feel like they're protected. Nobody's going to copy their brand. The consumers feel like they're protected in some ways with some privacy features and such. If you could create that relationship, I think that would be very interesting. I have purchased the Humane Pen. I do find it really interesting as kind of a form factor change. And I've thought for a long time, like this could all be reduced to a button. Like why couldn't we reduce all of this phone interaction to a button with a camera on it? And is the future some sort of disassembly of like what are the three things? There's compute, there's screen, and there's camera. If you could somehow like disassemble those things so that let's say the glasses you wear have the camera and the compute lives in your back pocket and the screen could be a laser like the Humane Pen or some other form factor, but there are lots of interesting inventions here. I want to take this to a broader thought or question, which is, it feels like this AI revolution is leading us to the world in beta. It feels like everything now is this sort of period of like everything is in beta, like the world is in beta mode. The upside of that is we're going to see lots of interesting invention, trial, creation of stuff that we haven't seen before. Potential downside of everything in beta is stuff is going to break, and we just have to be prepared for some amount of that. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, two thoughts. I'll start with the world in beta, and then I also want to touch on your point about Apple being developer focused, because I think it's incredibly prescient, because I think they're actually running that playbook through the Vision Pro right now. So I want to return to that thought, but to put to formalize my thoughts around the idea of the world in beta, I think it's true. And I think it's a side effect of the seismic shift that at least people think we are going to see because of AI. Right. So it's been kind of at least 20 years, if you think about the birth of like the internet as we know it, since we've seen the opportunity for a platform shift like this. And I think we can, let's leave aside the argument whether like how much of a platform shift the smartphone was or wasn't relative to the internet. And if AI is more like the smartphone or if it's more like the internet, but focus on for a moment, just the fact that AI will introduce new paradigms. And so there's just a burgeoning interest in building for what those new paradigms might be. And in many ways, I think it's really exhilarating. And I think it is like in some ways wildly speculative. I think you've got a lot of people taking as many shots on goal right now as possible. I think some of them will stick, and I think some of them kind of will not stick. Well, I'll throw it to you real fast. Go ahead and react to the world kind of in beta, if you will. But then I do want to return to just the building for developers if we have time.
Yeah, I think the whole world in data thing, like to me, like especially all the news, maybe it's just biased by perspective, but the more and more news I see and just like about the tech realm, like, okay, Cyberpunk 2077 just gets a little bit closer. Like we're approaching like, maybe not like flying cars, but approaching like the world of just like, okay, like your doctor is just like a bot you speak to and it just like sends you meds through some drone or something. Like everything, like, it feels like a lot of tech is evolving very, very quickly. And I kind of agree with the sentiment where it's just like, it feels a technological, like at least like revolution feels weird to say, but at least like maybe like a renaissance per se, where like a lot of stuff is being experimented with and tried in like all sorts of domains. Like you look at VR, XR, you look at like drones, you look at vehicles, we look at AI, like everything in like the human technology stack is being touched in some way or another. I think that's really exciting. Like, I think that's fun. In regards to like the whole developer platform, I think it's kind of funny how much Siri dropped the ball, but at the same time, like now that you guys like mention it, I think it'll be really interesting to ever see if like Apple lets you have like a Siri app store. Like, cause all of a sudden, like not only do you have like your AI like tool, or like if you are a developer trying to make like AI first tools, if there's a Siri integration, congratulations, you have a Vision Pro app, you have a watch app, you have an iPhone app, just out the box. And then if they let you like connect that to sensors, let that connect to like personal data, whatever it may be, connect to like Apple Cloud, you have a very, very potent, just like set of features out the box. You know, it's not just like ChatGPT web browsing. It's not just image generation. Now it's like, hey, my job is to like assess how you're doing mid run and like spit back the data to you, tell you to slow down or speed up or push a little bit harder because I know that based on the food you ate today, you can. So it'd be cool. I think I kind of got my start, like my first like I guess like startup project was an app on like the like Apple like platform, and they're just like their code design. Obviously, it's all Swift. You have to pay $99 a year to be a developer. Of course, everything you do has to be reviewed and submitted. But beyond that, like coding in Swift is it's just kind of like nice. Like as opposed to like every other thing where there's like 70 libraries, some of them suck. Like you have to go browse the internet looking for the way to correctly achieve the thing you want to. With Apple, it's just like, oh, you want health data? Click on this health thing, like just import that, ask the user for permission, congratulations, you have it. It very much feels that in like an API driven world where you can code however you want and like implement however you want, that's going to be less friendly. But if Apple owns it, I can imagine like the developer experience will just be very, very enjoyable. Just very nice.
I think that's perfectly well said. I think that's also a perfect launching point to kind of share the thoughts that I was alluding to earlier, which is as contrasting how easy it is to develop on the GPT store with how difficult it is to develop on the Apple store. I think that is the perfect juxtaposition of built for professional developers and then released to non-professional developers. And that kind of, again, is in direct reference to the point that I was going to make about the Vision Pro, which is they've started at a $3,500 price point, which is relatively inaccessible to the masses, which means they've kind of shifted the emphasis of that platform to people who are willing to invest larger sums of money to develop on the platform. So the kind of hypothesis I'm running with at the moment is that a lot of people who are going to be picking up this Vision Pro in the early days are people who are specifically developing for it and want to build onto it as a platform, and thus are willing to pay the increased price, or just simply people, VR, XR enthusiasts or high net worth individuals who are just simply kind of price insensitive to the new technologies that they want to try. So I don't know, kind of rounding out that thought, it's just a very stark contrast, I think, between GPTs who can be built, for $20 a month, essentially, by anyone in almost no time at all, versus a $3,500 price point entry building in kind of the most, polished or kind of, thoughtfully designed XR platform in the world. So
I just want to just tangent slightly by saying this environment that we're stepping into, whether you're building professional apps for a $3,500 Vision Pro or hobbyist, we're heading into an era of fun, and I think that startups are fun. Working in a startup and working on a startup is really fun. It creates a lot of room to try things, do things, take on challenges outside the corporate system. And I have to be honest, I've seen a lot of corporate jobs, and a lot of them are really, really boring. And most people in those corporate jobs are not having fun. And I think it's one of the beautiful things about being in the environment of entrepreneurship is that there's a lot of fun to be had. I just want to touch on one other component of this, which is the massive deflationary effect that all of this will eventually have. By deflationary, what that means in practice is that prices will come down for things. Anything that AI can find its way into will dramatically drive down the price of that thing in time, because the way the supply chain that we use presently to deliver that good or service will be reduced dramatically by an AI agent or an army of AI agents doing that same work for a fraction of the cost, and thus price competing against the incumbents and winning market share by offering lower prices. And so I think, if you're hunting for businesses out there and you're thinking about starting a startup, find something that's expensive and inject AI into it and offer it for 10% of the cost. You're going to build a business for yourself, and it's probably going to be a lot of fun.
The other thing that I saw, which was interesting on that similar thread of the kind of deflationary effects of AI, is that there's I think some insight circling that people who feel their jobs might be at risk because of kind of these proliferating AI systems are less likely to negotiate more strongly for themselves right now, right? They can't really command as much of a salary increase if they feel like they're also being potentially supplanted by AI. So another kind of second order effect where AI might drive some prices down in some industries across. I think for better or worse, we could debate, but I think it'll be interesting regardless. Okay, well, we are about at time today, so thank you all, as always, for joining us for the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Please leave your thoughts and comments in the sections below, and remember to check us out on all of the typical podcast platforms, especially on our YouTube channel at ScholarAI. All right, see everybody next time.